to launch a new publication titled Is Geography Destiny? And that publication is so up to date that, in fact, it's going to arrive at some point during this presentation. In fact, it's going to be an interactive presentation. People will come into the audience, not dressed as African safari animals or anything, but they will come into the audience and they will pass out copies of this report to you. So if you do have cold hands, this will be very warm, and it'll warm you up as you're sitting there. I guess I should tell you, my name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. I am enormously grateful to the people who have helped us organize this event, and most of all, I'm grateful to my colleague Chris Wilson, who coordinated this publication, worked incredibly, and we finally got the publication together. And I think its timing couldn't be any better. As you all know, we have the North American Leaders Summit tomorrow in Toluca, in Mexico. It's an opportunity tomorrow for the three leaders to come together and to discuss a number of issues that are pressing in the region. Some of us are doubtful about what will actually be achieved. There will be a number of minor agreements that will come out of the meeting. But I think that most of all, this is an opportunity for the Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto to really showcase a lot of what happened last year in Mexico with his ambitious reform agenda, and to highlight as well the fact that Mexico is now a rising power in the world. This is a dramatic change in the story and the conversation about Mexico from what we saw even only 18 months ago, when Mexico was seen as being one of the tragic cases of an emerging market that was unable to control questions of public security. And of course, in all of these things, it's never just black and white. There's a much more nuanced story there. Peña Nieto's interest in pushing Mexico's image in the world, of course, goes hand in hand with the interest of the three leaders in pushing North America as a region, and to highlight the fact that North America has become one of the most competitive regions, if not the most competitive region in the world. The Mexican reforms of last year are just one element of the story. Of course, another element is what we've seen over the past few years in the dramatic advances in achieving energy security and energy independence in the region. In addition, we've seen the return of manufacturing from other parts of the world, in particular Asia, to the North American space. And we've seen impressive progress on moving ahead with regulatory and standards harmonization in the region. But it's not just a moment for us to reflect on what we've achieved in North America and what is actually happening in the region today, but it's very much forward-looking. This is an opportunity to look ahead to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and to see how North America fits in to that bigger global reality, a highly competitive global reality. Our session today is in two parts. In the second part of the session, we will be talking about the publication, Is Geography Destiny?, with the participation of myself, David Biet, Director of the Canada Institute, Christopher Wilson, the lead editor and author of the report, Associate at the Mexico Institute, and Andrew Finn, Program Associate at the Canada Institute. But to begin with, we're delighted to have with us Carlos Gutierrez. Carlos Gutierrez, who is a very, very good friend of the Wilson Center, and we're delighted to have him here supporting our work at the Mexico Institute and the Canada Institute. Carlos Gutierrez is Vice Chair of Albright Stonebridge Group, provides unparalleled international trade and investment expertise and management talents to ASG's clients. He served as U.S. Secretary of Commerce from 2005 to 2009 under President George W. Bush, and served also at Citi, where he was Vice Chairman of the Institutional Clients Group and a member of the Senior Strategic Advisory Group. As many of you know, Mr. Gutierrez was born in Havana, Cuba. He joined the Bush administration in 2005 after spending nearly 30 years with Kellogg Company. He's worked in Latin America, Canada, Asia, and the United States. It's extraordinary that somebody has this breadth of experience both in the public and private sectors. Mr. Gutierrez is also chairman of Republicans for Immigration Reform, an issue that we're sure to revisit a number of times this year, and I hope that you'll join us again for those conversations. Republicans for Immigration Reform is a political action group that he co-founded in 2012. He also serves as a national trustee at the University of Miami, as a visiting scholar at the University's Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies. He's on the board of trustees of Meridian International Center and a member of the board of the U.S.-Mexico Foundation. He also sits on the boards of the Occidental Petroleum Corporation, MetLife Inc., and Time Warner Inc. Mr. Carlos Gutierrez, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan, and good morning to all, and thank you for your interest in this critically important issue of North America and where we go from here and how do we take NAFTA to the next step. I don't think there could be a better time for this summit that takes place tomorrow in Toluca. This is a good time for Mexico. It's a good time for the U.S. It's a good time for Canada. And therefore, it's a good time for the three countries. And I hope and wish that there is political will to really rise to the occasion and go beyond just, a check the box sort of a meeting where the leaders agree that they're going to turn it over to a working group, and that's sort of the extent of it. The world is regionalizing. We all know that. We've been seeing it for years now. Probably the single biggest event to take place over the next 5 to 10 years is the regionalization of Asia. And we've heard of ASEAN +3 and ASEAN +6, and there's a new acronym for it, but it's going to happen. And it's going to be the biggest trading bloc in the world. We've got the EU. Russia's even looking at, their customs union with Belarus, with Kazakhstan, looking to expand it. So regionalization is going to happen before globalization. And what a great opportunity to strengthen the bonds between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. Unfortunately, tomorrow's meeting is going to be fraught with politics. I recall when we tried this in 2005, it was called the SPP. Some of you may recall that, the Security and Prosperity Partnership. The meeting was in Crawford, Texas, 2005. A lot of optimism, a lot of desire to get things done. And as soon as we got to work, we had the right and the left throwing bombs at us, which is amazing because, we just wanted to make things more efficient. We actually had, I think if there's one criticism of the SPP is that the goals were very modest. I think our ambition should have been larger. But, the criticisms were this is going to be a new EU. They are plotting a new geopolitical area where the U.S. is going to lose sovereignty. The NAFTA superhighway is going to disregard any boundaries. In fact, they had invented a new currency, which we were said to be ready to put in place, and they actually had a name for it, which was incredible. They called it the Amero. They're actually, plotting behind the scenes to trade in the dollar and the peso and create this new currency called the Amero. So this will not be an easy task, and I think if anything, it's going to take more political will than it normally should. So I'd like to just talk about some things that we should be ready for, some things that I would like to see, and perhaps avoiding some of the mistakes that we went through and some of the things that we could have done better. So the first thing is be ready for opposition. This is not going to be easy. In fact, opposition, if you notice some op-eds, has already started. And it's just going to intensify. And I think we need to, instead of being on the defensive as we were and as we usually are when it comes to these types of things, trade, integration of countries, we should go on the offensive. This is good for the country. This is good for the three countries, for the region. This is good for our competitiveness. So we should be ready for that, and we should be ready to go on the offense. The second thing is I'd be very careful with priorities. Let's see what comes out of the meeting. But there's tremendous pressure to come out with a laundry list of things to do. So whether it's government officials, who sort of want to clear out their inbox and their outbox and put every single issue they have pending with Mexico and with Canada, or every industry group wants their issue on the agenda. And what you end up with is, you know, a list that is so long that you can't execute, and the exercise essentially becomes one of writing reports and reading reports, but not enough action. And this is going to be about execution. You know, there are some real basic things that we need to get done. There are still products that go through 3 testing protocols because we can't agree on one test protocol for the 3 countries. So Mexico will test, the U.S. will test just in case Mexico missed something, and Canada wants to test as well. That happens in many industries. Those are, you know, I'd like to think that's low-hanging fruit, but nothing these days is low-hanging fruit. But there are inefficiencies to be had by attacking, you know, those very basic and almost administrative type issues that we need to address. But there are big issues. There are going to be elephants in the room that I hope are discussed. And I hope they're discussed beyond just simply saying, let's have a working group deal with it, and they'll come back to us in a year with a report. So the first issue I would put on the table is energy. And we all know the story, but this is a wonderful time for these 3 countries, unique. We have been blessed with the opportunity of our lifetime. Shale gas and shale oil. Mexico is reforming energy. Canada is tremendously frustrated over the Keystone Pipeline. I mean, we've got things that, you know, again, politics. I was frankly very disheartened by Secretary Kerry's comments the other day about global warming being the new weapon of mass destruction. That doesn't bode well for what the decision will ultimately be for the Keystone Pipeline. What a shame that we don't get that done and that Canada decides to turn elsewhere to put a pipeline to send their shale gas and their shale oil. So this is going to take political will, but somehow this has to be on the agenda, and it's got to be more than let's see what the working group comes back with. I would hope that there will be plenty of pressure on all 3 countries to do something on this end. But we can talk about global warming, and let's remember, or global climate change, it is global. So either we produce the oil or somebody else produces the oil, and we might as well do it here. But we've got the opportunity to change the game. We have been dreaming for decades and decades and decades about energy independence. Here's our shot. And I hope that the 3 leaders see it as a strategic issue and not just something to be passed on to a working group. The other point that I think merits discussion is trucking. We have been at this for too long. This was part of the 1994 agreement. 2007, we finally did a pilot border demonstration project. 2009, it was canceled. Why? There was pressure from unions. So Mexico at that time, after years and years of sort of waiting, they slapped tariffs on the U.S. So here we are, you know, these 3 countries who should be totally aligned in conflict. The tariffs were taken out in December of 2013. We still have limitations as to how far trucks can go. Drivers have taken drug tests, driving tests, eyesight tests, any test. I mean, you name it. They've taken the tests. And a lot of these trucks are just as safe as trucks on this side of the border. The irony is that we have a shortage of truck drivers in the U.S. And as urban centers become larger and larger and larger, and if there's one trend that's taking place as we speak, is that cities are becoming bigger. So that last mile, we take it for granted. We go to the supermarket, the product is there. How does it get there? How does that one last mile look like? We can be so much more efficient if we finally got this issue out of the way. The other point is agriculture. And this is still a very controversial issue. By the way, this is one of the only sections where we don't have a NAFTA agreement. There are 3 agreements. It's done trilaterally. There's an agreement with Mexico, an agreement with Canada, because agriculture is so controversial. I don't want to minimize this, but agriculture is 2% of our GDP, but it's like 40% of our emotional GDP. And this is what stands in the way of so much progress in these trade agreements. And I'll talk in a second why I think this is an enormous strategic issue for the U.S. The other issue that I would hope will be discussed is border security. But by border security, I don't mean let's try to round up as many gardeners and people who are working and people who are taking care of adults and people who are working in hotels, and let's round them up and throw them out. I'm talking about guns going south and drugs coming north. We have a high-tech army forming up on our northern border, on our southern border, sorry. A high-tech army. And we have more coordination with faraway lands and a lot more dollars that go to faraway countries. But very little is said about what are we doing to protect the 3 countries from continued assault, whether it be cartels, whether it be organizations that want to do us harm. Again, I would hope that we see this strategically. We have tremendous success with Plan Colombia. I don't believe Plan Merida has done much. The dollars have been too small. They have been too slow. And frankly, we have not made progress. The other point related to both border security and agriculture is I hope they talk about immigration. There is a provision, as you all know, in NAFTA, the TN visa. So today there are 73,000 holders of TN visa, professionals in the U.S. I'm not suggesting that they cut an immigration agreement. That would be a bad idea. And I think it would make Congress a little bit nervous. But we should be talking about it because down the road, the future of these immigration agreements will be bilateral, trilateral. It's not enough for a country to pass an immigration law. We need Mexico's support to make sure that we're working together so that they also have accountability for immigration, as well as Canada. So I'm not saying let's have these leaders negotiate an immigration agreement, but they should start thinking about how we can help each other. And in the future, my humble prediction is that we will start to see bilateral immigration agreements, regional immigration agreements, very much the same way we see trade agreements. And this is a good place to start. The TN visas are professionals. When we talk about immigration, it's easy to talk about high tech, and we want engineers, and we want the best in the world. But here's an interesting fact on the Senate bill. There's a quota for agricultural workers, and that quota is 110,000. We need 1 million agricultural workers every year. Some people say 700,000, but a heck of a lot more than 110,000. So what are we going to do? We don't have a robust agriculture agreement, but we don't have enough workers in agriculture. So should we start talking about how do we feel about importing our food? Maybe that's what we should be talking about. But we can't have it both ways. And we've got to connect the dots that these two things are related. So again, joint accountability, the idea of let's all be accountable and let's take responsibility for each other's immigration accords. We can't be close friends and then, you know, try to sidestep and try to go around the agreements. I would hope that at least be discussed, that it at least be part of whatever they issue as a result of their talks. We think of immigration as something that's binary. Either you have citizenship or you have nothing. The future is about circularity. The future is about people coming to the U.S., working for 3 years, and maybe going back to Canada, maybe going back to Mexico. American citizens working in Mexico, maybe coming back in 4 years. You know, it doesn't have to be a permanent sort of a state. So why not talk about, can we recognize a nursing diploma that's issued in Mexico in the U.S.? We have a shortage of nurses. What a wonderful opportunity to start working towards those types of agreements, of treaties, of accords, recognizing each other and being surgical about it, whether it be nursing, whether it be other professions, but that we recognize that an education in a given country works for the U.S., whether that be Canada or Mexico. That would be a huge benefit for the U.S. So this is going to be tough. Any talk of immigration is tough. But just think of this. In 1970, the average Mexican woman had 7 children. In 2010, the estimate is about 2.2. There will come a day where there will be no Mexican immigration. And I hate to think of the irony of that. Where we'll be saying, my gosh, I wish we had more immigrants. We just don't see that far. We can't see beyond the 2014 election. But again, that's also a strategic issue. How we deal with these issues will at least convey whether we see that these discussions are serious or if this is a show. And if it's a show, what a shame, because there can be nothing more important than to get our act together in our immediate proximity, in our immediate geographic proximity. So we ask the question, is geography destiny? Yes, you're darn right it is. Geography is destiny. One of Mexico's greatest assets is that it has a border with the U.S. And you know what? One of our greatest assets is that we have a border with Mexico and a border with Canada. So we have exported to Mexico, we have imported from Mexico, we have done business in Canada, but we don't think about the tremendous benefit that we've had from the workers that have come from Mexico to the U.S. And what would it be? What would this economy be if we didn't have them? So my wish for these talks is that we go in thinking they are strategic, they are important, this is the future, this is how we will compete. And I hope that the 3 leaders exercise the political will and have the foresight to see it in that regard. We're not going to get everything accomplished, but let's start something that has endurance, that has longevity, that we can keep going for the next several years and even for decades. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Look at that. Perfect timing. The publication has arrived. Yes, the ink may still be wet, so handle it carefully. We have a little bit of time here to take a few questions from the audience for Secretary Gutierrez. I have a couple of things on my agenda. Margaret, if you would like to take the lead, and then we have another one over here. If we could pass the microphone, please, and if you could announce yourself and you give your affiliation. Right here in the middle. There we go. We got one coming in on the from your left.
Thank you. I'm Margaret Daly Hayes. You, in your list of issues that need to be dealt with, you didn't deal with the impression that NAFTA has been a net loss of jobs for the United States. And while the statistics are increasingly mixed and so forth, and maybe there have been more jobs lost in Mexico than in the United States, what is your sense of what the fact is on that, and what do we do really to persuade, to convince the American population that this is not a losing proposition?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we went back and did, when NAFTA was 15 years old, we went back and looked at the 15 previous years before NAFTA and then 15 years after NAFTA, and we found that just about every economic indicator, GDP, inflation, unemployment, in the three countries had improved. Now you can turn around and look at another study and it'll tell you something else. The problem with talking about national numbers is that it doesn't answer the question for someone in South Carolina that lost a job. So I think that the way to get the point across is not through national numbers. It's company by company. It's district by district. It's city by city. So if a company is benefiting from NAFTA, I think they should explain it to their employees and explain how and explain why. Because we can't, national numbers are way too abstract. But I'll tell you something, I've been associated with Mexico for longer than I'd like to admit, because I'll be quoting my age. But I'll tell you, I've been associated with Mexico for about 45 years. And it was only after NAFTA got going that we stopped seeing the hyperinflation, that we stopped seeing, you know, the periodic crises. We had one in 1997. That was 3 years after NAFTA. But you look at Mexico today, you look at Canada today, and look at the U.S. numbers even with the Great Recession. So, but I think that the answer to your question is it's company by company. Every company should explain to their employees, this is why NAFTA is good for you, why it's good for the company, and why it's good for our ability to survive in this very competitive world.
Thank you. Eduardo Del Boy?
Yeah,
Could you give your affiliation, Eduardo?
Yeah, Eduardo Del Boy. I'm a retired Canadian Foreign Service officer. I served at the embassy in Mexico from 95 to 99. And my question is, you know, when I was there in Mexico at the beginning of NAFTA, there was always this sense that Canada did not want to be confused in the United States with Mexico. And my question is, how is the balance between the NAFTA relationship and the bilateral relationship between Canada, United States, Mexico, United States? Has that changed in the past 20 years, or is there still an emphasis on being different from the others so that the Congress here, which has a very, very short attention span, doesn't get confused between both countries?
Yeah, I think that two things. I worked in Canada, and I love Canada and Canadians. I do believe that the national nightmare in Canada is that it somehow be confused with a 51st state or be confused with another country. And I understand that. And boy, that is in the psyche of every Canadian. So I think that's a reality that we need to understand and we need to be sensitive to. I found that over the years, Canada started to have bilateral discussions with Mexico. I believe they're still going on, that there was recognition that this is a truly strategic relationship. All three countries have changed. I mean, I go to Mexico, and the change is just enormous. I thought at the beginning of NAFTA that Mexico would be a winner, Canada would be a loser, and the U.S. would be neutral. And I was wrong. And it's fascinating to see how Canada is one of the biggest supporters of free trade in the world. You know, when the Great Recession happened and everybody started protectionism and Buy America and every country in the world started looking out for itself, it was Prime Minister Harper who said, we're going to lower tariffs. And that was a tremendous show of leadership. So I think there's been a lot of evolution, a tremendous change, and a recognition that, again, these three countries are tied through geographic destiny. But I've been very impressed with the Canadians and how they've managed this.
Thank you. Question right here in front.
Thanks. Martin from the Consortium of Universities for Global Health.
Yes, sir.
One question. You brought up urbanization. I think there are incredible opportunities for sharing information within the three countries on how to deal with the pressures of urbanization and build smarter cities. There's great innovations, as you know, in all three countries on how to do that. And I hope what comes out of this will be an opportunity to share a mechanism to share that information. My question, though, deals with the carnage taking place in Mexico rooted in drug wars. And you referred to the trade of drugs and weapons. What chance do you think there is for Mexico to bring up the issue of changing drug laws here in the U.S. that will reduce demand, initiatives that have been proven to work, that will deal with the demand situation, and will dramatically reduce the security issues here and also in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's probably, you know, the one elephant in the room that I'm not sure they will talk about. I would hope that President Peña Nieto brings it up, but they're watching what's going on. You know, Uruguay started this. They legalized marijuana. We have Colorado and Washington. There are countries throughout the world who are looking at this in Latin America, in Europe, and looking at, is there an opportunity here to decriminalize marijuana and focus on the stuff that's really hard and hurting populations and getting, you know, and really making a dent. But this is all tied to prison reform. It's all tied to what is Mexico going to do? Are they going to respond? Are they going to say, if you do Colorado and Washington, we want to try Mexico City? But again, these are the issues that are tough, but that if we're not talking about them, you know, then we're never going to make progress. I think Mexico is worried about this, and I think they're also anxious to get a sense of where the administration is going. But anything that Mexico has done to decriminalize, I think we have criticized. But now they have the opportunity to say, wait a minute, we're looking at what's happening. We're looking at statements. We're looking at declarations that are being made by the Justice Department, by the President. And we want to know if your policy towards Mexico has changed. So I appreciate your bringing that up, and I hope it is. I mean, if that's on the agenda, then it was a great meeting. I mean, it just shows that people are talking about things that make them uncomfortable. And that's what I think makes a good summit.
I do have one more question here. Somebody who's been anxiously trying, and then we'll move on to the second part of this session. Thank you.
My name is Alex Panetta. I'm a reporter at the Canadian Press. Canada's anxious to build pipeline infrastructure to get its oil here more cheaply and efficiently. Mexico is in a hurry to get to improve its extraction technology. I'd like to ask you whether there is a competitive tension between those two, or can there be a perfect symbiosis of interests? In other words, is there a kind of race to get the oil to Gulf Coast refineries, and would there be an impact, and who gets there first with an upgrade of technology?
Well, we were just talking about this before. This is also a point of we need both countries. And we need Mexican reform, and we need Canadian shale oil and Canadian shale gas, and we need U.S. shale gas and shale oil. The thing is, how do we move it? And unless we have the pipelines, we're going to continue to move it in rail. We have seen that rail is probably not the ideal way to do it. But I don't think there is a competition. I think Canada would love to see Mexico be part of the solution. And you know, it's not only the exploration and production, but then there's the midstream business, or how do you refine it? Where do you refine it? And that is, as Duncan was saying to me a little while ago, that's also one of these, you know, elephants in the room. We don't have enough refining capacity. So I don't think there is a competition. If anything, I think there's a little bit of a concern that Mexican reforms will not be enough, that they won't go far enough. But I don't think there is a sense, at least between the three countries, of trying to keep one down over the other or competing. There is so much to compete with around the world that you know, we could still produce a heck of a lot more, and have vast opportunities for exports and for energy independence.
Please join me in thanking Carlos Gutierrez.
All right, well, good morning. Now that you all have the publications in your hand, we're going to turn the discussion towards the publication that just came out today, hot off the press. And I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about really why we chose to write this report. This is the 20th anniversary of NAFTA, and I think we sort of felt compelled at the Mexico Institute and at the Canada Institutes to discuss the topic, to look at North America this year. And of course, the summit provides the perfect opportunity to have a very timely discussion of that. But I think there are a couple of different ways that we could write the report, and so I wanted to explain why we decided to do it the way that we did. You know, it was 20 years ago when the three countries decided to embrace geography, really, and form an economic community. And it's, you know, NAFTA is still the central architecture of this relationship, of this trade and economic relationship. But it seems that when we're talking about NAFTA, we're still talking about it in the terms, generally speaking, in the public discourse. We're talking about it on the same terms that we were talking about it 20 years ago. The conversation is stuck in a rut, and the same arguments are repeated again and again. And some of those are important arguments. I mean, NAFTA did boost trade investment. That's correct. There were winners and losers in the process. That's absolutely correct. And those are important things to hash out. There have been lots of reports that have done that before. And so we thought that there was another element that hasn't really been given as much consideration as it needed. And that's the fact that the world has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. The world of 1994, of the debates over whether or not to pass NAFTA, was fundamentally different in many ways than the world that we're living in today and making a decision about where to go forward in North America. I mean, some of the things that happened, the democratization of Mexico, the change from a single-party country to a multi-party democracy, the attacks of 9/11 and the resulting increase of border security, the accession of China to the WTO and just its rise on the global stage as a manufacturing powerhouse, as the factory of the world, development of oil sands in Canada, new drilling techniques for shale oil and gas in the United States and really now spreading all over the world. The global economic crisis of 2008-2009, the rise of organized crime-related violence in parts of Mexico, the list goes on. This is really a different world, and I think that the starting point for discussion about what we're doing in North America today is better served by jumping off from that point than jumping off from the point of what was going on 20 years ago when we were deciding whether or not to pass NAFTA. And so we tried to create a report that took that into account. I think there are two ways to tell the story of the impact of all these developments that I just mentioned on North America. There's one pretty pessimistic story that you can tell, and there's one that's pretty optimistic. I think both of them contain elements of the truth, so I'm going to just use my time to very quickly tell both of those two stories, and I think that's a way to jump into this conversation that could be useful. So up here what we have on the top line is a very common measure of regional integration. It's the percentage of trade that happens within North America, so the percentage of US, Mexican, and Canadian trade that they do with their partners, all combined together, as a percentage of global trade. So how much trade we do within the region compared to our total trade with all the world. The stories start the same, the optimistic and pessimistic one. They start with the period from 1993, the implementation of NAFTA in 94, up to 2000 of rising integration. Trade between the NAFTA countries doubled in that period. Regional integration really took off in a way that made sense given the big policy changes that NAFTA signified. In 2000, Mexico took a major step in its process of democratization with the election of Vicente Fox. And at that point, at the turn of the century, the prospects for North America looked very bright. The pessimistic side of the story goes that in 2001, everything turned down. Everything turned to the south. 9/11 created the need for stronger border controls. It made that very pressing, felt very clearly. But the way that those were implemented resulted in a thickened border, making it harder for commerce to get across the border, long lines at the borders, made visa applications more difficult for people. So the movement of goods and people across the border became more complicated. At the same time, it pulled U.S. attention, sort of high-level attention, the White House level attention, away from our neighbors and towards the Middle East and Central Asia, making things harder to advance. The same year, the U.S. experiences a recession, and China joins the WTO, sort of its coming out party as this manufacturing powerhouse. The increase of trade between China and the United States and China and all of North America rises very quickly from there. Factories in the United States, Canada, and Mexico pick up and move to China in some cases. This is a sort of a frightening year for the prospects of North America. After this, Canada and Mexico really fought to keep the borders open. That became maybe one of the centerpieces of their relationships with the United States. But they tended to do so in a bilateral fashion. So we have smart borders agreements, but we have one for Mexico and one for Canada. More recently, we have a 21st century border initiative with Mexico. We have Beyond the Border initiative with Canada. The one flicker of hope was the one that Secretary Gutierrez mentioned, which was the Security and Prosperity Partnership, this effort for regional integration in the mid-2000s. But unfortunately, as was discussed, it fizzled out just as quickly as it started, really. And where we're left? Well, we're left with regional integration numbers that have gone back down to where they started before NAFTA in that simple but important measure of integration that we talked about before. And this policy approach that's dual bilateral instead of trilateral, generally speaking. We have a North American Leaders Summit happening tomorrow, but it's really all that we have left. It's all that we have left in terms of trilateral engagement between the three countries. Okay, that's one story. There's another way to tell the story too, and I think this one's equally important. First of all, just look at the increase of trade between the three countries. This is the line of rising trade between the North American countries. You see that it continues to climb, even as the percentage of trade compared with other partners has declined. But the amount of trade that we have between our countries is just impressive. Each country in North America trades more than $1 million with its NAFTA partners every minute, more than $1 billion every day. This is just a huge volume of trade, this huge commercial and economic relationship that's developed because of geography, because of partnership that we created through NAFTA, for several reasons. But this boom in trade caused a type of integration that was actually, to a large degree, unexpected when NAFTA was implemented. It caused a depth of integration that was not expected. It caused the creation of a manufacturing platform that spanned the entire continent. It means that we now don't just produce products individually and then sell them to one another, we produce them together. So a car built in North America is just that. It's a car built in North America, not in the United States, not in Mexico, not in Canada, regardless of what the final export stat comes from, where the final assembly is done. It's built with pieces that come from across the continent, pieces that cross the borders multiple times as that car is being produced. So that means that the North American countries, when we talked about the NAFTA debate, when we had it, we talked about the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico. That was the big fear. That's not the fear anymore. The big fear is of the giant sucking sound of jobs going to China right now. But what that means is that our North American partners who we build things with are actually the ones that we now rely on to make sure that there is no giant sucking sound, to make sure that jobs stay here in North America and don't go overseas to places where we actually are competing. One way to understand this through the numbers is that when a final good is imported into the United States from Mexico, that good contains 40% US content. When it's imported from Canada, 25% US content. Those are very high figures. When it's imported, a final good imported from China, it's just 4%. That means for every dollar we spend on imports from China, only 4 cents of that stay in the United States. Whereas when we trade with our North American partners, a large amount of that money stays supporting jobs and industry in the United States. It's a different relationship. We're now partners. This system, this co-production system, was challenged by the rise of China, challenged by the post-9/11 security measures, but it has survived. And in fact, some of these global pressures have pushed us up the value chain. And the case study of that is Mexico, a country that made T-shirts and shoes, but has largely lost those industries because of foreign competition. What have they done? Well, they've moved into the auto industry and the aerospace industry. They've been pushed up. They've been pushed into areas where they have a stronger competitive advantage, whereas a country with a rising middle class can take advantage of its human capital. And that's where the future of North America lies. It's things like the rise of wages in China and changes in exchange rates that mean that there's actually a renaissance happening in manufacturing here in the US. There's a change in global structures that are making it more attractive to manufacture in North America. So some of those factories that picked up and moved to China in the early 2000s are actually picking up again and are growing their footprint in North America. And this is an important change. This is an important change that changes the outlook for the future. Add on top of that the issue of energy, which I'm sure we'll hear more about as the conversation progresses, and you have lower energy costs declining, which are a very important input into manufacturing. If you lower those energy costs as they're an input to manufacturing, you make your regional manufacturing more competitive. And so the way to finish this more positive story is to say that this political process that's become fragmented, that's become dual bilateral, US-Mexico and US-Canada, can actually work. It can promote a trilateral, stronger North America. The only way that it can do that, though, is if we don't allow the tracks that are maybe parallel or sometimes even diverging to do so. We have to keep them at least parallel and maybe even converging. To do that, we need a roadmap. We need to know where we're trying to go. We don't have to make every agreement right now about how we're going to get there, what some of the specifics are. We don't have to have all the elements of the Beyond the Border Agreement with Canada immediately apply to Mexico. We don't have to integrate the Trusted Traveler programs immediately, but we need a strategic vision to make sure that as we head in that direction, as we head in the direction of a stronger, more competitive North America, we don't end up with two systems that aren't possible to converge, that aren't possible to harmonize, that are fundamentally different in nature. We need to have communication and cooperation along the way so that when we get to the point where we can trilateralize some of these things, we're able to do so that the bilateral efforts become laboratories, tests for best practices, and then become trilateralized when it's appropriate to do so. And so I think that's the context in which we start looking at North America in a publication like this. And it's just that shift of taking a trilateral lens that allows you to have this different perspective on these very sometimes intractable issues bilaterally. And so that's what we're trying to do here. Thanks a lot.
Okay, over to me. I wanted to, is geography destiny? For Canada, I think it is destiny, only not necessarily in the best sense, the good sense of the word destiny. It's more like we're stuck with them, stuck with Mexico. Canada did approach the United States for the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which was negotiated through the 80s. And Mexico approached the United States on a free trade agreement that ultimately ended up in NAFTA. And Canada kind of had to go along. It didn't want to be left out. So Canada was sort of brought along for the ride, not necessarily that it wanted to be, but I think shook its head, looked around, said, okay, there's probably some good things in it for us. As Chris just mentioned, it really has evolved into a system of two bilaterals, Canada, United States, and Mexico, United States. Although trade has increased significantly, almost exponentially between Mexico and Canada, it started from such a low level that it's not nowhere near the level of the other two. Big issues right now are for Mexico and Canada is the visa issue.
Canada imposed visas for Mexican citizens about 5 years ago. Even though Canada has recently changed its immigration system, eliminated the visa for the Czech Republic, which it had instituted at the same time, it's still dragging on. And the Mexicans are quite angry about it. The Mexican ambassadors brought it up several times in Ottawa and publicly, and it's a very, very big sore point. I'm not sure it's going to get resolved at this summit tomorrow, but I think there may be some indications that the wheels are moving, that things may get better. Security is another issue that's planned to be speaking. Canada does have small interests in Central America, but as we talked about earlier with the bilaterals, Canada, and as Secretary Gutierrez mentioned, Canada does believe in free trade, and it's sort of gone on a bender, if you will, like Mexico, signing individual free trade agreements around the world. Energy is certainly important, particularly energy infrastructure, and competitiveness and value chains. That again, picking up what Chris said. And interestingly, there's big support in North America, the 3 countries of North America, for increased North American integration. But there's also some really loud voices in there that get more attention than the folks who think it's a good idea and don't say anything. Canadians, as sort of been mentioned here, are sort of miffed at the United States about the Keystone Pipeline. I think as well they should. But it's a process here that's been going on, and the President and the Secretary of State have said it's a long process, you'll just have to wait. And the Canadians want it done now, and understandably. But I think on the Canadians' part, by constantly harping on it or whining, as you will, it's not necessarily going to be best. It's not the best route for Canada to take. Canada's also a little bit wondering why Canada doesn't have a U.S. ambassador yet, after almost 9 months after the previous ambassador. I mean, come on, it's not that tough a deal. But I think in overall North America, NAFTA, or at least in the United States, NAFTA means Mexico. NAFTA doesn't really mean Canada and Mexico. It's Mexico and, oh, yes, Canada. But we need to talk about that. And Americans need to know that Mexico is not the Mexico that at the early days of NAFTA, even before NAFTA. Mexico is a completely different country. And I think Canada needs to realize that now, too. Problems for the United States and Canada is fast track. Interestingly, the TPP, even though we are working, quote, together on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we're in it together, we're not approaching it as a North American unit. The United States is out there getting what it wants. Canada is out there to get what it wants, Mexico what it wants, but we didn't go into it as sort of the NAFTA block into TPP. I think that's interesting. And there's also TTIP. The United States is doing that because Canada went ahead and did its comprehensive economic trade agreement with Europe, and Mexico already had its free trade agreement with Europe. So you're going to have these 3 things going on, but is it really the best thing for North America to do when we could go from this potential strength we have with an evolved NAFTA moving forward? We need to remove tariffs and non-tariff barriers more. Borders need to be fixed, and I think Andy will talk a little about that, and the same with regulatory alignments. One big thing, I just came off a NAFTA conference in Montreal last week. One of the big things there was talking about institutions. Well, we didn't want institutions with NAFTA. And I was trying to explain to my Canadian colleagues, I said, look, if Congress isn't going to cede trade authority to the President, to the Executive of the United States, do you think they're going to cede it to Canada or to Mexico? Let me leave it at that. Thank you. Andy.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. First off, I'd like to thank Chris, Duncan, and the Mexico Institute for allowing myself and David to participate in this and to help write this publication. I'll be fairly brief so we can have a little more time for questions. Just going to quickly go through what we touch on in the Borders and Security chapter. First off, kind of a discussion about the explosion in trade after NAFTA, and then when you get to 9/11, the thickening of the border, and then the attempts to de-thicken the border with the SPP, which, as has been mentioned a few times, sort of unraveled, and now we have the dual bilateral system. Within that, the major border security component in Canada, which I obviously know about more, is Beyond the Border. It's going ahead. I think we're now in year 3. We just did a program, an update on it, and there are some, there are some boxes being ticked, and there's some good things happening there. We can get into maybe some of the specific programs a little bit later. Kind of the 3 topics that I focused on trilaterally for the issues confronting the continent. First off is, drugs and the violence that comes with drugs, and how do we deal with that. One of the things that came out of this is it's not just a Mexico-U.S. problem. There are drugs made in Canada that come down to the United States, and the United States is a major conduit for drugs from Mexico all the way through, and drugs grown in the United States going up to Canada as well. Second one is firearms. This is a huge problem in terms of violence. Obviously, the volumes are much different between Canada and the United States, but actually the percentages are fairly similar when you look at crimes and homicides committed with firearms made in the United States. We can get into that a little bit later as well. And then finally, in terms of business travel, migration, movement of peoples, and all those types of things, this was one of the areas where well, Chris has said, and I think it's a great recommendation, to look at everything through a trilateral lens. But this is obviously more of a bilateral issue between Canada, or between Mexico and the United States, whereas Canada
going to be perhaps the less attractive element of what's going to happen tomorrow in Toluca. These summits have always been called the Three Amigos summits. And I think at no other time in North American history can we say that there is less friendliness going on between certain parties who are going to be at the table in Toluca. There's a great joke going around Mexican social media right now about how Toluca is not exactly the most beautiful city in which to hold this summit, about how President Obama has tried to convince his wife, Michelle, that she should spend Valentine's Day with him there in Toluca because it's the city of romance, in good, true Mexican black humor. But the fact is that there are going to be serious issues in terms of the diplomatic relations between the 3 parties. Prime Minister Stephen Harper is there today, of course, and holding bilateral meetings with Peña Nieto. And in those meetings, the issue of the Canadian visa requirement on Mexicans is going to be front and center from the Mexican point of view. The fact that the Mexican ambassador in Ottawa uses the term "we are still very angry about this particular visa requirement" gives you a hint of the depth of feeling. And I think it's very, very interesting. If we were to go back to 2009, when that visa was first implemented, applied to Mexicans, and think about the way in which it was announced. Remember, the purpose why, the reason why Canada wanted to apply the visa to Mexicans was, 1, because they'd already applied it to every other Latin American nation. 2, and most importantly, because there was a rising number of Mexicans seeking refugee status in Canada because of Canada's very, very generous refugee laws. And thirdly, because, of course, that had caused a domestic political firestorm. When they announced the visa, though, they gave Mexicans about 1 week to prepare themselves for the visa requirement, which meant that, and this happened just before the summer, a large number of Mexicans who had booked their summer travel, in particular for their children to go to summer camps in Canada, found themselves unable to get the visa in time. They lost their deposits on summer camps in Canada, and it caused an enormous amount of bad feeling. Now, it reached the depth of bad feeling in Mexico so that it was actually mentioned in a telenovela. And you've become famous. I remember the Canadian ambassador, Gil Ryshinsky, a terrific ambassador, noting once in a public meeting, he says, you've done something wrong when you get mentioned in a telenovela in Mexico. The scene is that a young man comes home late. His girlfriend says, "Where have you been? Who are you with?" etc. And he says, "You're asking me more questions than the Canadian embassy does when I go for my visa." And he said, this was an idea of how much we had really screwed up on the public messaging of this particular visa issue. Since then, the Felipe Calderon government actually kept pushing on the visa issue, saying, why have you applied this visa? What's going on? Why do you insist on sort of punishing our people when we're all partners in the North American space? But then it kind of died off towards the end of the Felipe Calderon administration. But almost immediately, when Peña Nieto's administration came into power, the issue re-emerged, and it has been front and center in the bilateral relationship since December of 2012. Now, this issue, as I say, is going to define the meeting between Prime Minister Harper and Peña Nieto today. It won't be the only thing, of course, and it's recognized that at some point, progress and change will have to be made. The Canadians are going to be offering apparently new airline routes between Mexico and Canada to try to say, look, we're easing the passage of Mexicans into Canada. Of course, it doesn't do anything to ease the restrictions and to ease the paperwork of applying for your visa, but they're trying to make some kind of effort here. But that problem between Canada and Mexico, I think, stands in contrast with the very, very positive relationship that exists at this point in time between Mexico and the United States. Despite the problems that exist on the conversation about public security, organized crime, and the Merida Initiative, the two countries have established a very positive, forward-looking economic agenda, the high-level economic dialogue. We see parallel to that the US-Mexico CEO dialogue. And at the same time, the Mexicans, and now with slightly less enthusiasm, but still going along with the plan, the Americans, talking about educational cooperation. That educational cooperation, I would say, is one of the most important long-term issues in the bilateral relationship, and it should become one of the most important issues in the trilateral regional relationship, and I'll come back to it in a second. Of course, we've already heard about the issues that exist right now between Canada and the United States with regards to Keystone. David has talked about the whining attitude of the Canadians, and it's not just on Keystone. It's on a number of issues. I mean, speaking to folks in the State Department who say, you know, it's difficult. It's very difficult when you meet with Mexicans and everything is about what are we going to do next? Let's do this, let's do that. And the Canadians are constantly complaining about, well, there's problems here, there's problems there, there's problems there. It's very much in terms of a socialization process that it's much easier. You look forward to meeting with the Mexicans and not quite so much to meeting with the Canadians. But despite those issues and despite those tensions that exist, I would say that there is a lot to be very, very optimistic about, even, of course, in the Canada-US relationship and the Canada-Mexico relationship. These things will pass, I think, is the message that I would want to put out there. Despite these temporary problems, the long-term future for all three of these countries is, of course, in the region. We've talked about energy already. Secretary Gutierrez gave a great exposition on that. And he touched on the fact that we've got this embarrassment of riches right now in North America. And it's going to create certain tensions and certain questions out there, particularly to do with infrastructure. Pipeline infrastructure, obviously. We also need to talk about cross-border electricity transmission. We need to talk about gas pipelines going across the border from the United States into Mexico to make sure that cheap American gas gets into the market there to drive Mexican economic competitiveness, to really confirm and to cement that the nearshoring of manufacturing capacity in North America. The embarrassment of riches that we have is not just about the oil sands from Canada. It's not just about the Mexican energy reform. Of course, it's about U.S. Oil and gas coming from shale and from tight oil formations. Some of the estimates are that in the next 18 months, we're going to have another 1 million barrels a day being produced in the United States alone. And where does that oil go? And of course, the question from our Canadian colleague about where do we, what happens to the Gulf Coast refineries? That's a very, very important question. At some point in the United States, we're going to have that conversation about, are we allowed to export crude? It's a very, very important question. If we don't export crude, what do we do with it? Do we put it into the strategic oil reserve? Do we start, finding new holes that are there, maybe in the Gulf of Mexico, that we can fill up with oil again? We pumped it out, now we'll pump it back in? It's a bizarre idea. One of the options is, of course, to think about this on a regional basis and to say, look, we know that we have enough demand in the United States to absorb all of the oil that is produced in this region. There's no doubt about that. So why don't we start thinking about how we can convert that crude oil into the products that we actually need in the marketplace? Rather than thinking about exporting crude, why don't we think about building refineries in North America that add value to the crude and bring it to the market? That's one of the things we can do. And of course, we come up to the classic NIMBY question. Who wants a refinery in their backyard? Very, very few people. There's all of the environmental concerns. There's all of the concerns about property values, et cetera, et cetera. Well, one of the things is that the Mexicans have been talking about building new refining capacity for many, many years. And it's an issue of national importance there. They've been unable to advance on the Tula refinery, which was projected, which was actually approved back in January of 2009. Nothing has happened on that refinery except for basically securing the land on which it was supposed to be built. That was supposed to be a refinery of 300,000 barrels a day. Interestingly enough, exactly the same capacity as the Keystone pipeline will be bringing in when it eventually gets built. If we're looking at not just 1 million extra barrels from the United States, Albertan production sort of heading up into towards the 5 million barrels a day mark, and Mexican production looking at adding another 1 million barrels a day over the next 10 years. We need a lot more refineries in North America if we're going to process all of this. Refineries, remember, mean jobs. Refineries mean value added. And of course, refineries mean valuable investment in infrastructure. Those are the issues which I say we need to talk about on a North American basis. Yes, it would mean exporting some crude from the United States into Mexico, but why is that such a bad thing? That would be a very, very simple solution from my point of view. I want to touch upon the NAFTA effect on Mexico that Secretary Gutierrez mentioned as well. Our colleague Luis Rubio, who is from CDAC in Mexico, who is here as a visiting fellow this spring, has often talked about the fact that NAFTA is important not just because of the trade and investment advances, but because it locked in a process of economic liberalization that had begun after the debt crisis in Mexico in the 1980s. That's something which is very, very important to recognize. By signing this international treaty, remember, for the Mexicans, it's a treaty, not an international agreement. By signing an international treaty, it committed all future Mexican governments to the path of free trade and attracting foreign direct investment. That has meant that we have moved away from that cycle of sexennial crises that we used to have in Mexico. It's meant that even when we saw the return of the pre-party, that pre-party is committed to the path of free trade and investment. That's a very, very important factor to celebrate as we look at this 20th anniversary of NAFTA. And it also inspires us to look ahead and to think about what something like the TPP could do for Mexico as well, by committing the country, not just now, but in the future, to that path of free trade, integration, and global competitiveness. But despite the successes of NAFTA, for Mexico and for the other countries, it's certain, and it's been mentioned here already, that there were winners and losers from NAFTA. One of the things that we didn't do well in North America was to think about ways in which those losers could be compensated. And I'm not talking about subsidies. God knows we have enough of those already. I'm talking about ways in which we can actually prepare the people of North America for the future. And this brings me to the question of human capital. As I mentioned earlier on, one of the most interesting and intriguing issues that is there on the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States is something called the FOBESI, the Bilateral Forum on Higher Education, Research and Innovation. That is committing the two countries to working together on higher education university exchanges, looking at collaborative research, and looking at the question of how do you inspire innovation in the region. And the two countries have quite different approaches to it, but at some point they will be compatible. What we need to do now on the basis of North America is to look at where we're going to get the highly skilled labor from that we need for the future. As many of you in this room know, Mexico graduates more engineers every year than the United States of America. In other words, per capita, about 3 times as many engineers. Those engineers may not have the same level of higher educational skill or level of education as their American counterparts, but American companies are snapping them up as immediately as they come out of college, because they know that they are basically engineering literate and they can be trained for the tasks that American corporations need them for. But we're also looking at the fact that this is not just American firms that are going to Mexico, but firms from around the world. There is now a global competition for human talent. What we need to do is we need to think about the ways in which we can train that talent in Mexico, train the talent that's coming through in the United States and in Canada, and use that talent within the region. Part of this is to do with immigration, part of it's to do with visas, part of it is to do with making sure that educational standards are harmonized across the region. And although these are issues which are going to affect us 5, 10, 20 years out, there's also that point that Secretary Gutierrez made, which is that Mexico has passed through its demographic boom. We're not going to see those waves of Mexicans heading forth in the future. Young Mexicans are now at a premium, but we're still in time to capture that big bubble that exists in the demographic pyramid of Mexico as it works its way through, so the 15 to 25 age group. We need to think about how we get those people interested in careers, in educational degrees that actually prepare them for the workplace. We need to think about how the young people that come after them are being prepared in the STEM subjects, the science, technology, engineering, and math subjects, so that they're ready to move into the university degrees that are needed. I would say that that, above all, should be one of the priorities for the three leaders as they meet at Toluca. It's one of the issues that is a positive issue. It enables you to think way out. It enables you to provide some kind of vision, and it enables you to actually talk about something that you could work on a trilateral basis way into the future. With that, I will close. And Chris, we open it up for questions?
Yeah, I think we can take a couple of questions from the audience. We'll start with Secretary Gutierrez here up front. We're going to bring you a microphone here, if you don't mind, just for the cameras and webcast.
There's been a lot of discussion about jobs returning from Asia to Mexico and the U.S. and Canada, but mostly to Mexico. Are we seeing evidence of that? Are we seeing that in the numbers?
Yeah. Actually, for those of you who have the publication, there's one chart that I was going to actually put up here also, which is on page 18. And there I actually summed up manufacturing employment numbers by, just millions, just actual jobs in the three countries. And it's when you look at the North American line, which is the top line on that chart, that you can see the biggest increase that's happened in the last couple of years. Now, of course, this is following the recession when the number of manufacturing jobs declined. So we are seeing it, but perhaps we shouldn't expect that this is the trend for the future. I mean, just as decades ago we had the transition of farm workers to the cities in the United States as farms became more productive and didn't need as much employment, we're seeing the same thing happening in manufacturing. I mean, quite frankly, manufacturing production has continued to rise this entire time, even as manufacturing jobs have declined. That's because of these huge advances in manufacturing technology, the rise of advanced manufacturing. These are computers and complicated machines that are computer-driven that can just produce things that we needed a lot of labor to do previously. I mean, that is the future in the long term. So I don't think we can depend on that to solve the jobs challenge entirely, but of course it's got to be an important piece of it, is finding ways to tap into this. Now what's happened is that as this transition towards advanced manufacturing has happened, it turns out that we have more less skilled workers than we need, and not enough skilled enough workers to run those machines, to program those machines, to fix those machines and robots, and then actually, of course, to do the design work in the first place that really drives the innovation process. So I think going forward, I mean, this gets back to the human capital issues that Duncan started with there. I mean, we need in each of the countries individually to figure out ways to make sure that our labor force matches the needs of the labor market, of the job market. Then, on top of that, we can do some things collaboratively across North America to make sure that where there's an excess of people, of nurses, and there's a demand for nurses on another place in North America, that we can, do the best job possible through labor mobility to fill the gaps with the labor supply that's out there. In addition to that, research partnerships to build human capital. I mean, I guess the point is that this wave that's pushing factories back to the U.S. is important, and right now, in the short term, it's holding up and even propping up some growth in those jobs numbers. But we can't just take that. We can't just sit back and say that's good enough. We can't just expect that that will continue forever. What we need to realize is that this is a great moment, a resurgence of competitiveness, and that is sustainable. But this resurgence in jobs is in the midst of a slow transition to where you need less and less physical labor in factories to produce things. That means the services sector is the wave of the future. That means we should be looking at ways to increase our ability to export services within North America and to places around the world. It puts forth a whole series of challenges that we need to take very seriously. We should take advantage of what's going on right now, but look for the long-term future and rise to those challenges as well. Other questions?
Yes, this is an excellent panel. Thank you very much. Chris, I wanted to know if you could elaborate a little on what you meant by integration. I'm a little confused, and there appears to be a greater integration given the product that's being put out at the other end with the increases in trade, yet you cite integration. Is that bilateral, trilateral?
Talking about trilateral integration, but I think the question you drive at is a really important one, which is what does it even mean in the first place to talk about integration? And there are different ways to conceptualize that and different numbers that you'll attach to each of those measures. I mean, one way to think about it is just the amount of transactions that happen across the borders. And in that sense, you'd just look at the trade numbers and you'd say trade has continued to climb, and therefore we're continuing to integrate. We're more tightly bound together than ever before. Another way to think about integration, to understand it, is how close you are to your neighbors compared to what's happening in the rest of the world, compared to how close you are to another country half a world away. And in that sense, that's when you take the numbers that I showed, which are the percent of trade that happens within the region compared to the percent happening with the rest of the world. And we see that, I mean, really, quite frankly, what's happened is that the GDP growth of the rest of the world has started to outpace GDP growth of North America. So the rise of China means that we trade more with China. The growth of Indonesia means we trade more with Indonesia. The growth of India means we trade more with India. So part of it's a natural process, and we shouldn't be afraid of globalization happening alongside regionalization. But it does drive home the point that we aren't as interdependent as we were before in the context of just volume of trade, just simple volume of trade. Now, the depth of integration, the what are we trading with each other, now that's changed dramatically. In that sense, we're much more dependent on one another than ever before. Now, a final way that I didn't even get into in this publication to think about and then look at integration and measure it is something called looking at just a border effect. So the question there would be something like, you'd look at how much Colorado trades with Nevada, and how much Colorado trades with Mexico. And you'd compare the two, and you'd figure out how much harder is it to trade with Mexico. Control for GDP, control for everything, and see how much is that border deterrent to trade. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen, the numbers are pretty complex to run. There have been a couple of studies that have tried to do that. But I think, unfortunately, what we'd see there is that there really was a 9/11 effect on the borders. They really have thickened. And as a result of that, in another sense, we're not as integrated as we were before, because it's harder for goods and people to cross the borders than it was previously. And we're trying to resolve those things with these new initiatives, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done to get back to a point where we just have NAFTA as something that opens the flow of positive movement across the borders.
If I can just add something here, I mean, just to build on what Chris was saying, I was in Laredo, Texas last week, and was at Texas A&M International University there. It's a very vibrant place. They have strong engagement from the private sector there. And so we had a couple of meetings, a lunch meeting, a dinner meeting with people from the local community. What's extraordinary about that place is, I mean, they're talking about, and I'm not sure that these must be up-to-date numbers, but they were talking about $240 billion a year passing through that port. It's the third largest port of entry in the United States after New York and Los Angeles. That's an extraordinary thing. So you think about how much crosses that border every single day. And then you start to think about what minor, small little things like paperwork, like not enough lanes at the border crossing mean for the crossing of those goods that are vitally needed, not just because getting to the final mile to the consumer, but probably more importantly for getting to the next stage of the production process, in an integrated production process. And so, coming back to Chris's first definition of integration, in the North American space, I think that's what really defines us more than anything else. You know, I had a conversation with a French journalist yesterday who was asking me questions about what does North America mean, etc., and came at it from a very European Union point of view. You know, where are the institutions, etc. And I said, you have to understand that's not what it's about in North America. It's much more about integrated production, integrated economies. And he said, you know, kind of like how we have in Europe with the same standards. And I said, no, that's a different thing as well. You know, we've been less successful in harmonizing our standards. Although we've made some progress, we've been less successful in that. It's about integrating our economies and our production processes in such a way that these problems that emerge at the border, which should be easy to solve, become vitally important to address. And I hope there's going to be some discussion of that in Toluca tomorrow as well.
Can probably take another question if there is one. We're also getting close to the time. Okay. Well, with that, I think we'll close things off. Thanks so much to fellow panelists, the Canada Institute, for supporting us and working with us on this publication. We really appreciated it. Thanks to all of you for coming this morning. Thanks especially to Secretary Gutierrez for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.